containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece, and Africa as the birthplace.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to embark on an intellectual journey, one that challenges some very familiar narratives. We'll be exploring a perspective suggesting the New Testament stories we know so well might actually have roots far, far deeper than commonly thought. We're talking about ancient Egypt. We're going to unpack the compelling and, sometimes controversial arguments of Gerald Massey. He was a prolific 19th century writer, an Egyptologist of sorts, and we're focusing on his huge work, Ancient Egypt, Light of the World. Specifically, Volume 2, Chapter 12, pages 840 to 852, looking at what he calls the Bethany group.
Right, and our mission for this deep dive is really to examine Massey's central assertion here, which is that key figures like Lazarus, Jesus, Mary, and Martha, they aren't entirely unique historical innovations. He sees them more as, well, replicas of an older, incredibly rich tapestry of Egyptian mythology, specifically the Osirian mysteries. So we'll trace these, frankly, surprising connections and reveal the profound insights Massey believed were hidden, right there in plain sight.
Get ready for some aha moments, maybe, because here's where it gets really interesting. Okay, let's start right at the heart of it. The central cast we know so well from the New Testament, Lazarus, Jesus, Mary, and Martha. These figures are so ingrained, right, in that narrative. What does Massey suggest about their origins, their archetypal origins in Egypt?
Well, what's fascinating here is how Massey posits a direct, really detailed correspondence. It's not just vague likenesses. He identifies Lazarus specifically with Osiris, or Asar, as the Egyptians called him, the god of the underworld, rebirth.
Okay. Osiris?
Yeah. And Jesus, he connects to Horus, Osiris's son, the divine child figure.
Horus, right, son of Osiris.
Exactly. Mary, the mother figure, he links to Isis, Osiris's wife, Horus's mother, the great goddess.
Isis. Makes sense in that family structure.
It does. And Martha, he connects her to Nephthys, Isis's sister, the other divine mourner and protector. These four, Massey argues, they make up the originals of the group in Bethany. He actually calls them the family in Anu, Anu being the Egyptian Heliopolis, and says this is the Kamite prototype of Bethany.
Wow. Kamite prototype. So he's really drawing a direct line, almost like a blueprint transfer.
Precisely. And it's not just about who is there. Massey also points out something interesting, a significant omission.
An omission? What's missing?
Sut, or Set, as he's sometimes known, the betrayer figure in the Egyptian Osirian group. Osiris's brother, the antagonist. He's a major part of the Egyptian mythos, but he's conspicuously absent from the Gospel's Bethany narrative itself.
Okay, so Sut isn't there with Lazarus and the sisters.
Not in that specific scene. However, Massey is quick to observe that a betrayer figure is present in the mortuary meal descriptions elsewhere in the canonical Gospels. So he suggests that it shows a subtle retention of that archetypal role, even if Sut himself isn't named in the Bethany context. The betrayal archetype was too fundamental to drop completely.
That is fascinating. The pattern holds even in its absences or shifts. This really comes alive, though, when we look at the core story of Lazarus's resurrection. I mean, that's such a cornerstone miracle. How does Massey draw parallels between that biblical event and the Egyptian accounts of Osiris rising from the dead?
Yeah, this is where the parallels become incredibly striking. Massey outlines a whole series of them. First, think about the setting. In the Egyptian myths, Osiris lies dead, like a breathless mummy, often in a cave or sepulcher. And who's watching over him? The two Myrte sisters, that's Isis and Nephthys. They stand at his head and feet. They're the keepers of the body, the watchers in the burial place.
Yeah, I can see the parallel. Lazarus in the tomb, Mary and Martha attending.
Exactly. It mirrors that scene very closely. Massey even explicitly calls Isis and Nephthys the Mary and Martha of Bethany, hammering home that connection.
Bethany. House of Anu, Heliopolis. Got it.
Yeah.
So the setting, the attendance. What about the actual call to life?
That's the next parallel. So Horus journeys to raise his father Osiris from the sepulcher in Anu. On his way, or there, he meets the two sister goddesses, Isis and Nephthys. And he proclaims his words of power. He says something like, "I am Horus, the son of Isis, and I am come to see my father Osiris," stating his purpose is to raise him.
Okay, and Jesus.
Well, think about Jesus informing Martha, "Thy brother shall rise again." And then that huge declaration from John's Gospel, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth on me shall never die.
Wow. The assertion of power, the promise of resurrection, it's very similar in function, isn't it?
It really is. The divine son figure arriving, declaring his power over death to the grieving sisters, intending to resurrect the entombed male figure.
And the act itself, bringing Lazarus forth.
Another direct echo. The Egyptian myth depicts Horus bringing Osiris forth from the cave, the tomb. And then you have Jesus in the gospel who cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth, that powerful command.
Lazarus, come forth. Okay. And their appearance after they emerge.
This is another really specific detail Massey points out. Osiris, when he emerges in this resurrection scene, often appears as Amsu. Amsu is a specific resurrected form of Osiris, often depicted as a mummy, but with one arm only released from the bandages. It gives him this sort of semi-corporeal look, still bound, but alive.
One arm free. Okay. And Lazarus.
Lazarus came forth, bound hand and foot, with grave bands.
Bound hand and foot. So again, that image of being bound, partially restricted, still in the grave clothes, but emerged.
Exactly. It's a very particular visual parallel, that state of transition between death and full life. And Massey reinforces the sister's role, too. He highlights Horus's words to his resurrected father, I have given thee thy victory, I have given thee thy two eyes, the Myrte, which also relates to the sisters. I have given thee Isis and Nephthys.
So they are explicitly given to Osiris as part of his restoration.
Yes, underscoring their essential role. And Massey also notes that little detail in Luke's gospel, Mary sitting at Jesus' feet like Isis, another nod to that archetypal positioning.
Okay, the parallels in the Bethany group and the resurrection itself are, well, they're pretty compelling when laid out like that. But if these core stories are, as Massey argues, replicas, what does this mean for the bigger picture, for Christian theology, history? He takes this much further, right? Connecting to really fundamental concepts, virgin birth, salvation, even hell.
Oh, absolutely. He sees these Egyptian archetypes underpinning numerous foundational Christian doctrines. Let's take the idea of the anointed one and salvation by blood, central concepts. Massey argues that the actual Egyptian word charis, which means to embalm, to anoint, to make the mummy, is the root of Christ, the anointed one.
Charis becoming Christ, wow.
He claims the mummy itself, the charis, was the typical Christ, the figure made eternal through anointing and ritual. And furthermore, he suggests that the concept of salvation by the blood of Isis, the Virgin Mother's blood, in some myths associated with Horus's conception or protection, is the original source for the doctrine of purification through blood.
Salvation through the mother's blood, not just the son's sacrifice initially.
That's what he posits for the origin of the concept. He points to child Horus, sometimes depicted as a blood child or painted red, who becomes a savior through suffering. Massey links this to early images of Jesus, sometimes shown naked and red on the cross, suggesting this earlier idea of salvation connected to maternal blood and the child's suffering.
So this really challenges the idea of where these core tenets originated. It suggests maybe a deeper, older, shared human understanding of sacrifice and rebirth expressed differently.
That's definitely one way to look at it. Massey frames it more as a direct derivation, arguing Christianity inherited and perhaps unknowingly literalized these powerful ancient Egyptian symbols and myths.
Right, what about hell and divine judgment? That's another huge one.
Right. And here Massey draws a sharp contrast. He looks at the Egyptian underworld, the Amenta. He describes it as a place where the truly irredeemably wicked faced, well, annihilation, not everlasting pain.
So just ceasing to exist.
Essentially, yes, a final end. He characterizes the Christian concept of a God of eternal torment as something distinctly Christian. He argues the Egyptian all-parental God, often conceived as both father and mother, had a son, Horus, who was often represented as a comforter, not someone overseeing eternal torture.
A comforter, that's a very different emphasis.
Very different. Even the Egyptian lake of flame, which sounds familiar, he says it was for consuming adversaries, for total destruction, annihilation, not for perpetually torturing human souls. And figures like Apap the serpent or Sutset, who became associated with Satan. Massey presents them as Egyptian concepts representing, physical forces, chaos, antagonists. They might be bound with chains in the myths, but they weren't seen as torturers of men in the same way.
So a fundamentally different view of justice and the afterlife. Annihilation versus eternal suffering, that's quite a divergence.
It is. And Massey sees the Christian version as a later, and in his view, harsher development.
What about the 12 disciples? Surely they're historical figures.
Well, Massey challenges that too. He suggests the 12 disciples aren't historical individuals in the way we usually think of them. He sees them as symbolic, 12 eons or powers originating in astronomical mythology.
Yeah, canonical, like the zodiac or something.
Kind of, yeah. Like the cycle of gods or divine powers often depicted surrounding Horus or the sun god Ra, particularly on the Mount of Glory in Egyptian texts. He basically asserts they are no more human than was their teacher, pushing for a symbolic, mythical understanding rather than a literal one.
No more human. So the whole group is archetypal for him.
Pretty much. He even takes the post-resurrection meeting on the Mount of Olives. You know how the Gospels seem a bit conflicted about whether it was in Galilee or Jerusalem?
Yeah, there are discrepancies there.
Massey suggests it wasn't on earthly Galilee at all. He places it in Amenta on the Egyptian mountain of the equinox, the mythological mount. By doing that, he argues, you resolve the geographical contradictions by seeing it as a mythical, symbolic event, not a literal, historical meeting on a specific earthly mountain.
That definitely reframes the narrative landscape, moving it from literal history to cosmic allegory.
That's a good way to put it. And he doesn't stop there. He draws direct comparisons between the qualities and titles of Horus and Jesus.
Okay, like what?
A whole list. For instance, Horus as the Word made flesh is mirrored by Jesus as the Word made flesh. Horus as the Lord of Resurrections matches Jesus as the Lord of Resurrections from the house of death.
Those are pretty direct conceptual parallels.
They are, and some are more. Provocative. Massey notes parallels like Horus of both sexes.
Of both sexes.
Yes, suggesting an encompassing divinity. He correlates this to things like Jesus as the bearded Sophia or Charis, the female Christ, interpretations drawing on wisdom traditions or Gnostic ideas, suggesting a feminine aspect to the Christ figure.
Wow, okay. That implies a much more fluid understanding of the divine archetype in the original Egyptian context, perhaps?
That's exactly his point. He suggests this more encompassing divine nature was part of the original archetype, and wasn't always idealized either. He even points to myths of Horus behaving badly to Isis, his mother, and finds a parallel in instances where Jesus speaks brutally to his mother in the Gospels.
So even the difficult or less flattering aspects get transferred in this archetypal echo.
Massey argues they do, showing just how thorough the transfer might have been, challenging the idea that the later figure is purely an idealized version. He also emphasizes Horus as the only begotten son of God the Father, a concept deeply rooted in Egyptian theology, with Horus sometimes considered to exist even before Isis, his mother, highlighting the antiquity of ideas like pre-existence and divine sonship. You know, exploring all this through Massey's lens really compels us to ask some big questions. What does it actually mean for our understanding of spiritual truth if these core narratives, these theological concepts, are seen as evolving from ancient archetypes, not necessarily as unique, singular historical events?
It definitely forces a reconsideration. Massey's own conclusion is, well, it's pretty potent, isn't it? He suggests the canonical Gospels by trying to make these ancient Gnostic, these hidden spiritual ideas and mythological traditions literal historical fact. They basically extracted, in his words, empty husks of pagan tradition minus the kernel of the gnosis, minus that deeper inner spiritual understanding.
Exactly. He even says that without this Egyptian foundation, the basis for a purely Judean history of Jesus becomes an accretion of blindly ignorant belief. Harsh words.
Very harsh. And he calls the canonical Gospels the most exoteric versions, meaning the most outward surface level.
Yes, most outward-facing, furthest removed from what he saw as the underlying hidden, buried, but imperishable truth found in the original Egyptian gnosis and mythology.
So what really stands out to you from this deep dive into Massey's perspective? It certainly makes you pause and reevaluate how these ancient cultures, their profound myths, how they might have continuously shaped and been reshaped into the sacred stories that still resonate so deeply today. It pushes us to look beneath the surface.
Absolutely. It encourages a critical look, sure, but maybe also an appreciative one, appreciating the universality of certain human experiences, death, rebirth, betrayal, salvation, and how they get expressed in different mythologies across time. It reminds us that maybe knowledge is most valuable when we can see it from multiple perspectives, understand how ideas travel and transform. Maybe these stories function on multiple levels, simultaneously historical, mythical, spiritual.
That's a great point. So maybe next time you encounter one of these familiar stories, perhaps consider the layers. Think about the echoes, the ancient echoes that might still be speaking through them, offering a wisdom that spans millennia, waiting to be heard in a new way.
Containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, mouthpiece, and Africa as the birthplace.